The American Civil War took place from 1861 to 1865. Its beginning and end dates pretty closely bracketing Abraham Lincoln's presidency. It's him and a few of the more celebrated public statements that he gave that we'll focus on today as a way to introduce this war. The Civil War was a war for survival. The Union must persevere. That was the mandate. And that was really the central reason for fighting from the perspective of the Union. And we will talk about, in an effort of, to understand all aspects of how this occurred, we will talk about the so-called lost cause of the South next time. But the central reason for fighting for the nation was the preservation of the Union. Freeing the enslaved population was a way to economically decimate the Southern Confederacy, which had its own problems, and plenty of them, economically, socially, and otherwise. Most conspicuous and central among those being that they based their economy on human capital. That fact, the practice of chattel slavery, appalled a great many people. And the abolition movement, driven in large part by the optimistic, liberally minded, and socially engaged evangelical Christian movement of the time, and other Christian groups, not as evangelical, that abolition movement really began in the late 1820s, early 1830s, and those dedicated to it saw it as an absolute, unambiguous, and obvious moral mandate. It was an imperative to end the heinously inhumane practice of killing, torturing, and dehumanizing the black population in the South. We see here William Lloyd Garrison on the bottom right, whose paper, The Liberator, became a famous abolitionist, a powerful and influential abolitionist tract. We see that just next to him. We see the Grimke sisters just to the right above Garrison. They were Quaker and they were from the South, and they rooted their abolitionist cause really deeply within their own Quaker tradition. And then we see Frederick Douglass, an enormously influential figure whom we will turn to more directly next time. Some of the more prominent abolitionist figures, and on the upper left we see what was probably the most influential visual campaign. Am I not a man and a brother? Am I not a woman and a sister? It really hit people who maybe were sitting on the fence in a moral, self-reflective kind of way. The moral imperative charged these abolitionists to act. That it was clear to them, to many, that the practice of slavery dehumanized even those in power, despite their surface level economic comfort, that it was a danger to the human soul. But it is naively optimistic revisionist history that looks back and sees the Civil War's casus belli as the abolition of slavery. The casus belli, the reason for fighting, again, was the maintenance and preservation of the Union. The moral framework of abolition, deeply, authentically meaningful to many, was also used as a propaganda campaign. And we will come to that. One other note on the Civil War: it retains the unfortunate distinction of being the American war with the greatest number of casualties, by far. That number has long sat around 620,000, which you see reflected here. Recent scholarship pushes that number up to 750,000, closer to 1 million. That's greater than the number of Americans who died in both World Wars, Korea, the global war on terror combined. So it was staggering. The carnage was visible and overwhelming and revolting. Conditions were poor. Well over half of the deaths, closer to 2/3, were attributable to disease, to typhoid and dysentery and gangrene. And also one of the causes for this, what we see here are some Civil War hospitals, and grave sites, and some roads. This was not uncommon to see bodies strewn about country roads. So one other aspect, and something that contributed to this massive death toll, was that this was a war in which technology outstripped tactics. Gatling guns, you can see in the middle, were used as were lined assaults. So you sort of line people up and march them towards a broad-based machine gun fire. Deaths, wounds were staggering. While America's wars of today, which are celebrated but unseen, while they retain a kind of illustrious but distant image in Americans' mind, the Civil War and its effects were immediately present to Americans. You could smell the hospitals from miles away. This was not a war that people could ignore. And as the presidency makes clear, Lincoln is really, as the dates of the presidency makes clear, Lincoln is really the president of the Civil War. The South really didn't like him. But he wasn't the dark horse candidate that some made him out to be. 1858's Lincoln-Douglas debates had already made him pretty famous. This was a series of debates, and they are in the cities, the 7 cities in which they occurred. They are memorialized most often in statue form as these two. Series of 7 debates, 3 hours each, no moderators, held during the Illinois Senate campaign. These debates were over, the main topic was over the extension of slavery into new territories. Douglas argues that the question of slavery's legality should be left to the states or territories, that it was not a federal decision, and he was also the 3-time incumbent for the seat. Lincoln argues that no new territory should get slaves, and gives his famous House Divided speech, which we see quoted at the bottom. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. This question had in some ways been decided by the Missouri Compromise of 1820, but the Mexican-American War added new territories, and the issue was brought to the fore once more. The Republican Party was really established at this time, in large part to keep slavery out of the Western territories. For the Senate seat, Lincoln won the popular vote, but Douglas won the electoral vote, and so Douglas won the seat. But what Lincoln won was notoriety. He became a viable presidential candidate. In these debates, Douglas really painted Lincoln as an abolitionist. He wasn't. He valued law above his own moral sensibility that slavery was wrong. Let's turn to the first inaugural, which you've read, wherein he becomes the 16th president. The clear focus for Lincoln here is the maintenance of the Union. He believes he has no lawful right, and further, he tells us he has no inclination to interfere with the institution of slavery. Now, some have argued, that he is here culpably neutral on questions of fundamental, foundational national justice. They will argue that these aren't questions of personal morality only, that he doesn't, as the president, have the luxury of distancing himself from making a decision, taking a stand on this. Slavery had long tainted the moral fiber of the Union and rendered toothless every claim to principle, virtue, providential exceptionalism. Whatever his personal moral stance, Lincoln makes clear that he is not an abolitionist, and this rankles some. Neither is he a secessionist or a supporter of secession. His arguments against secession, against the war, take several forms. Some are pragmatic. He says, you'll war upon each other, and after all the carnage, after all the loss, the same identical old questions as to terms of intercourse are once more upon you. He says, you'll fight, but at the end of the day, you're going to have to figure out how to work with one another, and you're still stuck next to each other. So it's just not worth the fight, the expenditure of a war. He asks his listeners to take a minute to consider precisely why they fight. But why really are you fighting? Some have found that disingenuous. He outright denies the human stake of those held in slavery. If by the mere force of numbers, he tells us, a majority should deprive a minority of any clearly written constitutional right, it might, in a moral point of view, justify revolution. Certainly if such a right were a vital one deeply connected to life, right? And then he goes on to say, but such is not our case. Those whose right to life was being, undermined and robbed through the practice of slavery would disagree. Constitutionally, it took the 13th Amendment, which was ratified in 1865, to abolish slavery, and then it took the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, to guarantee equal protections, which we will see in the LeBron article we will turn to next time, did not actually render a just union or guarantee any kind of equality under the law in practice. Lincoln would live to see the 13th passed, but not ratified. His argument is not exclusively pragmatic in this first inaugural. He also at times strikes an inspirational tone, pulling more or less effectively on the heartstrings and the loyalties of Americans, of all inheritors of the Union's promise. He says things like, the Union will endure forever, and the purpose of the Constitution, he reminds us, was to form a more perfect Union. He invokes that American character that was by this point established for generations in the national cultural consciousness, saying, intelligence, patriotism, Christianity, and a firm reliance on Him who has never yet forsaken this favored land are still competent to adjust in the best way to our present difficulty. He says we are exceptional. We have that character. Step up to the plate, Americans. We can meet this, right? It is inspirational in this way. The presidential persona that he inaugurates here, though, is conciliatory, primarily to the South, where he is not from, and where his largest body of dissent is. He stands for the maintenance of the Union at any cost. He hands the shape of that Union to citizens, not to the office of the presidency. He says, this country with its institutions belongs to the people who inhabit it. Whenever they shall grow weary of the existing government, they can exercise their constitutional right of amending it, or their revolutionary right to dismember or overthrow it. And that remains true today, though we're far less likely to be reminded of that point from the White House. In your hand, he says, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of the Civil War. He uses this speech to remind the nation that they have a civic duty and a constitutional frame within which to exercise their rightful authority as the people. He tells us that he would favor rather than oppose the putting forth of an amendment. And that's the closest Lincoln comes in this first inaugural to supporting what will become the 13th Amendment. I would favor rather than oppose the people putting an amendment forth. This isn't the fervently prophetic voice of truth to power in the face of institutionalized inhumanity that some wish it were, and that many of us have been enculturated to expect from Abraham Lincoln. But again, Abraham Lincoln is a man. He isn't some stably good divine figure in the American pantheon, sort of eternal in 19-foot white Georgia marble, silently judging the degree to which, we as the people enact and embody racial equality or even economically equality. Remember, he was also the poor kid from, shoeless in the harsh Kentucky winters, chopping wood and staying honest. That's part of the mythos associated with him. He has this kind of, godlike authenticity. But really, he is another flawed human, and we see this come out in the acts of his presidency and the speeches that he makes. He has less courage than an immortal, less foresight than some eternal principle might have. But what he has going for him is this. He's not a megalomaniac. He presents himself here as not as one who dictates authority, but as one who holds that authority in trust for a diverse, albeit constitutionally defined and limited in that way, population. All parties of which he serves, not all of which he agrees with. He holds, perhaps to a fault, to the democratic principle. The people will choose. That's not his right. It's not his mandate. It's not the oath he took, he reminds us. And if they choose poorly, well, he seems to say, then he is under oath to support and protect those poor choices. And he also has this going for him. He closes this speech by calling for and expressing a great faith in a moral realignment, which is a phrase that I pull from LeBron. Again, we'll turn to next time. He says, I am loath to close, which is an intimate and kind of invitational tone rhetorically. I'm sorry to leave. I wish I could stay. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. The passion may have strained, but it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land. And war here is one more time a kind of sinew that binds our sense of community, of time, of the cosmos, of the sacred, right? Those mystic chords of memory will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. As surely they will be. Speaking again, maybe culpably, maybe expediently, only to the people who have political power, he urges a hope for peace, an aspirational and morally conversant approach to political engagement. And he urges that that engagement be in the interest of the preservation of the Union. The Union, which is what by declaration and constitution grants political power and also limits it. In 1860, Lincoln is elected without the South. He wins 40% of the popular vote, out of 4 candidates, 2/3 of the Electoral College. He got the North, he got California, he got Oregon. And he inaugurates his new presidency with this speech given on March 4th, 1861. On April 12th, 1861, just a month later, Confederate troops fire on Fort Sumter, which you see pictured here, and the Civil War begins. The South secedes from the Union. Now, I'm not trying to tear down a hero here, and on balance, I think Lincoln is a hero of the Union, of American ideals. Trump has said that the end result of Lincoln's legacy is, quote, questionable. And to be clear, I do not agree. I think the legacy stands very clearly. And we should endeavor to see history clear-eyed, is my goal here. Lincoln did say several times in several ways, if I could preserve the Union without freeing a single slave, I'd do it. My priority is the maintenance of the Union. With the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863, Lincoln, it is said, Lincoln freed the slaves he couldn't in states in rebellion, over which he, at the time, did not have control, but he didn't free the slaves he could in border states of Michigan, Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, states not in rebellion. Slaves there fought on the Union side as slaves. Now, close to a year later, on November 19th, 1863, Lincoln delivers the Gettysburg Address, wherein he articulates a national creed. The death of a soldier in a just cause, battlefield death in war, is laid out there as sacred, as holy, as life-giving, the highest manifestation of the nation's ideals. This is redemptive violence given accomplished rhetorical voice. He says we cannot hallow this ground. In a way, it hallows us. If we're if we are but just enough to accept and manifest that, if we can but take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, if we can resolve, as he does on our behalf, that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth. We have a duty to the proposition that all men are created equal, and a duty to memory. We have a duty, says Lincoln, to both the past, that from the honored dead we take an increased devotion to the cause, and also to the future, that this nation under God should have a new birth of freedom. Still, the present is tricky, and it remains so. We'll turn next time to anthems, to the present day, to Donald Trump and John McGraw and Percival Everett. But to close with Lincoln, he's not an unambiguous hero. He fought for the Union. The North fought for the Union. In an earlier and storied moment, it's said that Andrew Jackson, whom we've already looked at, toasted John Calhoun, his own vice president, to the Union, may she ever stand. And Calhoun returns the toast with, to the Union, next to liberty, most dear. Now, Calhoun subsumes the Union to the liberty implied by and granted with states' rights. Both were slaveholders, Jackson and Calhoun. Calhoun more adamantly, asserting that it was a moral good, that the institution of slavery was, in fact, not just an economic, but a moral good. That's Calhoun. He also toyed with secession. Later, Jackson tells him that he will go to South Carolina and hang the first secessionist he sees from the first tree he can reach with the first rope he can find, which makes it clear that Jackson also is a preserver of the Union despite his slaveholding ways. For the political power players in the North, in the time of the Civil War, Union was the issue. And for the South, we can talk about the primacy of liberty most dear. And we have to, because that's the narrative. And as Renee Marie said in the article you read on Dixie, which again we'll turn to next time, we're not post anything. The South fought for liberty. Before we get there, though, let's look at the second inaugural given on March 4th, 1865. We're still in the Civil War, in what Lincoln tells us is the great contest which still absorbs the attention and engrosses the energies of the nation. Close to 750,000 people had died. Lincoln is still focused on the Union. Both sides read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other, he tells us. He speaks with malice towards none, with charity for all. He uses the first person plural throughout, we, us. Again, kind of rhetorically standing for that union. As at Gettysburg, he suggests here a moral position rooted firmly in the Christianity that has remained a central feature of American national culture, especially in these moments when we look upon ourselves as needing improvement, as requiring action in the interest of justice, of needing what, again, LeBron will call a moral realignment. Now, he gives this speech on March 4th, 1865. It is short, as is his second term. A month later, on April 9th, 1865, the Civil War ends when Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrenders to Union General Ulysses S. Grant, who would go on to become the president in 1869. At the Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, you see the painting of that on the upper left. That happened on Palm Sunday, and that was not lost on observers. It was. You can see in the bottom right, which was a newspaper that came out at the time, that this was understood to sort of mirror that Christian holiday in the liturgical calendar that celebrates the day that Jesus enters Jerusalem. Right? It initiates Holy Week and initiates the possibility of redemption, and so this. Lee surrendering to Grant, Grant accepting his surrender on Palm Sunday strikes people as meaningful. Now, a week after that, on April 15th, 1865, Lincoln is shot dead on Good Friday, which is the Christian holiday marking the anniversary of the death of Jesus. The date's symbolism wasn't lost on those who would perform the apotheosis of the 16th president. You can see a painting that was, a model of very popular paintings at the time. They already divinized, sort of American pantheon, central figure in the American pantheon that is George Washington, now sort of welcomes Lincoln into the pantheon of, a kind of cloudy heavenly sphere. He's transformed into this semi-divine savior of the Union who, quote, died to make men free. Now back to liberty. Right, back to the question of liberty, which I said we're going to turn to. When John Wilkes Booth had just shot Lincoln, which we see pictured in paintings here, right, he jumps off the balcony days after Lincoln's surrender, or Lee's surrender at Appomattox, remember. He gets caught because he jumps from the balcony of the theater to the stage and breaks his leg. And the doctor who set his leg, by the way, that man was hanged. Anyway, when he lands on the balcony, breaking his leg, he yells "Sic Semper Tyrannis," which continues to be Virginia's state motto. And it's Latin, it means thus always to tyrants, right? They will be killed. Setting aside the question of whether Lincoln was in fact a tyrant, that's the Declaration of Independence right there. Sic Semper Tyrannis. Tyrants will go down. We've seen this in the Revolutionary period, that this commitment and the willingness to fight and die for it is rooted in the foundational narrative of the nation. John Wilkes Booth believed that what he was doing was perfectly in line with the nation's foundational narrative, that Lincoln was a tyrant, imposing his will against the majority. Now, he was wrong. He had what LeBron will call moral cowardice, I would say. He believed that people could be property, but he thought he would be a hero, not just to the South. He thought he would be a hero to America. He thought he would be the great tyrant slayer who goes down in the nation's annals as himself rendered divine in a later day. We've seen this, and we still see this today, right? Timothy McVeigh, again, quoted this, loved it, saw himself in this lineage, right? Our response to it really turns on how we understand tyranny. Tyranny can mean either, right? We'll return to Jefferson for this quote, which is very pithy. When the people fear the government, there is tyranny. When the government fears the people, there is liberty. And this speaks to the power of the democratic vote, the power of we the people, right? But it doesn't speak to the nuances of what we mean by tyranny, which really does continue to affect us today. Tyranny means either mess with my property, or it means mess with my fellow man or woman, right? With the union. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, or life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? Is property happiness? Is a question that this presses upon us. Is the Civil War about slavery, enslaved human beings unjustly kept and tormented and killed? Or is it about property rights, which is this kind of states' rights that, were argued later, especially through Jefferson Davis? Do you believe this person standing in front of you is a human, created equal, deserving dignity? Or can you see them in terms of capital property, investments, interests, money? your individual security. Right? This is a question about slavery, about the Civil War, about the rights and equal protection of especially black people in ways that it's easy to see are relevant today, and in ways that it's easy to find the moral position on for most folks, I think. But it's also a question that's relevant to wage slavery, to border relations, to minorities and children and elders, all the people who might cost you, you know. We'll come back to the money with World War I, to that same old stupid plan of dog eat dog, of mighty crush the weak. Um, but next we'll turn to two anthems, a contemporary perspective on history, and a really great story. So I encourage you to think about think about how it is that tyranny functions in your own mind as a moral mandate, as a lens through which to see historical narrative, and what the role of the presidency is in terms of this. Does the presidency wield a kind of moral authority and power, an authority to shape and change laws, or does the president, rather hold that power and that authority in trust for the people, which in some ways is a self-effacing move that, as we've seen with Lincoln, does come under moral judgment, right? If you do self-efface and allow the people to choose, it's possible that you find yourself in a position where you can't stand against something as egregious and horrific as slavery. But if you assert your own authority over that of the people, then you see the sort of model that we've seen in more modern presidents, where the popular vote very clearly is, disregarded, and presidential will and constitutional checks and balances find themselves up in the air, to be questioned. So again, next time, to the modern day and art.